Has a car ever reminded you of a person? A family member, a friend, an enemy maybe, or a loved one? Well, this truck was owned by a man named Mike. And Mike was an avid lover of everything with horsepower and loved restoring vehicles. Now, during his lifetime, this truck was Mike's pride and joy, a meticulously taken care of, repainted, beautiful Toyota Tacoma. But unfortunately, since his passing, this truck has sat fairly neglected for the past couple of years and is in desperate need of some attention. So let's take a look at what we're working with here. Now, from the outside, this truck actually appears to be in phenomenal condition. And in reality, for a truck this old, it absolutely is. But let's take a little bit of a closer look and see some of the problems that we're working with. Now, one of the first things we're going to take a look at here, and something that's very common for a car that's sat for a while, is dry rotted tires. If you look really closely in the treads, you can see a lot of that rotting coming through, tearing these tires apart. And unfortunately, these just are not safe to drive on anymore. Then we're gonna hop inside here and take a look at any trouble codes that this truck might be throwing right now. If I can find the OBD port. Uh-oh, we've got a couple codes already. We've got a secondary air injection code, another secondary air injection code, and a third secondary air injection code. So all of our codes that we got coming off this thing, all three of them are secondary air injection codes. Now, this truck has what is referred to as a smog pump. It's something that helps with the emission system and gets more air in, so the hydrocarbons from the exhaust burn better when they go back through the intake manifold. And I'm almost 100% sure that's why those codes are being thrown. So let's go check under the hood and see if we've got a smog pump. Now, normally, I honestly don't care too much about emission systems. You've seen what I've done with my Camaro, and if you've seen any other vehicles that I've worked on, you'll know that emissions are not usually my top priority. But I don't like leaving a car with codes, so we're gonna do what we can here. So taking a look inside the engine bay, this is the 2.7 liter 4-cylinder Tacoma engine. And as we look around here, we're gonna notice this thing over here. Now, this looks kind of like a horn. Like if you hit the horn, that's gonna make noise. But instead, this is actually the smog pump that needs replacing. So I'm gonna pull that out and take a look at it, do a little test on it. We're gonna see if that thing is broken or not. But before we go and start taking this truck apart, we have a couple other things that I need to show you that we need to fix. Now, the next item is underneath the truck. If I look up here and zoom in a little bit, you guys are gonna see that this thing's got some oil on it. Yeehaw! This truck has a really bad oil leak coming from the front crank seal. Now, I've already cleaned up the area a little bit just to make it easier for me to diagnose where the oil was coming from. It's definitely coming from the front crank seal. So we're actually gonna have to pull the crank pulley off, and we're also gonna replace the belt while we're down here because it's looking a little bit worse for wear. But yeah, you can see that oil has gotten pretty much all over everything down here. It has been leaking for quite a while. Now, besides the oil leak, there's only two other small things that need to be taken care of here. One of them is the alignment on this truck is not really good. When you're going down the highway, you get a lot of wobbling, you get a lot of squirreliness in the steering. It just needs to be tightened up. And I'm actually gonna be doing the alignment myself. And the second thing is the brakes are a little bit spongy. When you push down on them, it goes about halfway before you get really any engagement at all. So we're gonna do a brake bleed as well. So nothing too crazy, but there is a lot of work to be done on this truck. So as a recap, we're doing the oil leak, we're doing the new tires, we're doing an alignment, we're doing the brake bleed, we're doing a new belt, and we're also going to replace the smog pump. So let's get started with the easiest part.
So while I start working on this truck, I want to talk to you guys about why I got this truck to work on. Well, Mike's daughter actually reached out to me to ask if I would be willing to help bring the truck back to life. And after hearing the story behind the truck and her father, I couldn't help but think of my own grandfather, who was a self-reliant lover of machines and was probably one of the best men I've ever met. And well, I also have a whole workshop full of tools and a deep longing to start other projects before I finish the ones I already have, so I offered to take it in for a week and get this truck ready to go back on the road and be a safe driving vehicle that will eventually go to Mike's grandkids as their first car. So given that this truck is going to a newer driver, I definitely want to make sure to focus on safety, so things like reliability, the steering alignment, the braking are all top priorities for me, and if we can address all of the problems this truck has, it should be a perfect first car.
So now let's get back in the truck, turn it over, and see if our codes are gone. All right, we got no codes stored in the modules right now. Everything seems to be working properly. We will take it for a test drive once we're done with everything else and 100% make sure that those codes are gone. But for now, let's jump over into a much harder part of this project, the oil leak. So step one of getting the crank pulley off is going to be getting our actual serpentine belt off first. Now, all you have to do is loosen the tension on the tensioner here using a breaker bar and a 15mm socket, and this thing just kind of slips off. Now, it is really good to try and remember which direction your serpentine belt goes. So instead of relying on documents on the internet, I'm just going to take a picture, make this easier for myself. Here we go, picture taken, tension released, and the belt comes right off. Now, you can lock these tensioners usually and make sure that they're really nice and safe when you're doing work on the car, but we have no need for actually locking the tensioner at this point. And I'm gonna take my socket off of the belt tensioner. Perhaps I will not take my socket off the belt tensioner, for there is too much tension. Ah, I see why they want you to lock these now. Instead of locking it, I'm going to push down on it with this piece of wood. That will take the tension off, and I will be able to pull the socket off. There we go. And there we go. Serpentine belt is off. This one has been compromised not only from the oil leak, but also just general wear. We're gonna replace it while we're in here anyway. Let's keep trash where trash belongs, on the floor. Now, one thing I do want to do before I install the new belt is make sure that it's actually the same as the old one. Lengthwise, this feels the same, but let's double check that. Now, there's no markings left on the outside of the old one, so we're just gonna have to do width and length and grooves, and everything looks to be good there. It's a real scientific test here. Yeah, they're the same. All right, so that makes me confident in completely getting rid of that one, and we'll install this one at the end of the project. So now that our belt is off, it's time to go into the fuse box and start pulling some fuses, because we're gonna do something really crazy to get that crank pulley off. Now, according to the fuse box here, we need to pull, there's no relay there, there's no relay there. All we have to do is pull this one. Now, what we just pulled is the COPN relay, which in theory, by pulling it, should keep the engine from being able to start when we crank it over. So before we actually commit to doing this, I'm going to double check that the engine will not start, but will crank. So that obviously didn't work. We can also try pulling the EFI relay, which is right here. And that's your electronic fuel injection relay. These things are really stuck in there. Now, pulling the EFI relay and the COPN relay together may give us the result we want. All right, there you go. That's the one. The EFI relay and the COPN relay, both out. Engine will crank, will not start. So here's where we're gonna get a little bit dangerous with this. I'm actually gonna put my breaker bar on the crank pulley bolt, and I'm going to crank the truck over. Now, that will crank with so much force that it should break the bolt loose without me having to try and spin the engine backwards in order to loosen the bolt. The forward motion of the engine should create reverse motion in the bolt, breaking it off and allowing me to pull the crank pulley off. So let's go into the truck and see if this actually works. So looking up under the truck here, we've got the breaker bar on that center nut of the crank pulley. The bar comes all the way out here and will wedge right up against here when it tries to crank over, ideally breaking that nut loose and allowing us to just pull that crank pulley straight off. Tacoma crank pulley release in 3, 2, 1. Let's see if she's off. I heard some loud sounds. Oh, and that bolt is finger tight now. Yes, sir. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that actually worked. I mean, I can totally believe that worked because I'm a pro. Ooh. Here we go. The crank bolt is out. It's held in with, I think, like 210 pounds of force, so getting that out, big accomplishment, didn't have to damage the engine, and this worked perfectly. If you're trying to get a crank pulley bolt out, use that method, it worked. So now I'm gonna reach down in here and pull off the crank pulley itself. I may actually need a nice pry bar or something to waggle that out. Wow, that popped clean off real easy. Now with the crank pulley off, you can see a lot of the oil that has caked up on this thing, particularly on the back. You can see a lot of this very, very wet oil on the actual shaft itself. So we're gonna have to clean all of this off, make sure that it's clean when it goes back on. Now real quick, I wanna show you guys how much gunk is actually in here. Look at that. That's all oil and dirt that has caked up over the years of this leaking all over this thing. Just absolutely filthy. You don't want that on your crank pulley. Yuck. So here's what we're working with underneath now. You can see where the crank pulley used to be right there. You can see that seal all the way around it, absolutely caked with oil. We're gonna clean that off. We're gonna pull that seal out of there. And then we're gonna pop a new one in, seal it up, put the crank pulley back on, bolt it down, and this job is done. I absolutely love it when problems are super obvious. Other than where I marred this up from pulling it out with a screwdriver, you can see a very clear reason why this seal was leaking. If I come up nice and close here, you can see right there, there is a little bit of a tear in the seal right there. That is not good. Oil's getting through there, absolutely. That could be caused by a whole number of things, age, wear, a lot of stuff. This seal is old, it's original, it's from 2007. We're gonna replace it with a brand new one. All right, you can now see where we pulled our old seal. We've cleaned up that surface up there, and now we're gonna put our new seal in with a little bit of RTV. Now here is our new seal. Pop it out of the box here. It should look exactly like the old one. Now what we're gonna do with this seal is put a little bit of RTV all the way around the outside edge so it makes a perfect seal even if there are imperfections in the block itself. So let's go ahead and crack open a brand new thing of RTV, seal it up, and get this seal locked in. So what we're gonna do is use some ultra red gasket maker. This is high temperature stuff. Pop a little hole in the tip, and we're not gonna use our little piping tube on this one. We're just going to pump it directly onto our finger. Just like that. And then we're gonna take it and wipe just a little bit all the way around the edge. Now I'm putting a thick bead on this to start just to make sure it's covered from side to side, and then we will thin this down appropriately because we don't need this stuff gushing and gushing out everywhere. That's not what we're trying for. Then use a clean finger to clean it up a little bit. Now this is what you're looking for, just a nice, clean, consistent bead all the way around your seal. This is not a thick layer at all. This is very, very thin amounts of RTV. All right, we've got our new seal RTV'd in. I gotta clean up that crank a little bit, but she is solidly in there. It's a little bit hard to get it in without any sort of socket to pound it in because the clearance between there and the fan, which is right here above me, is very, very little, maybe 5 inches at most. But we did have to use a few different methods to actually get it there. But it's in, it's sealed, and our oil leak should be stopped now. Now it's time to get our crank pulley all cleaned up here. Gonna spray her down with some brake clean. Give her a good rub. This thing is filthy, so we're not gonna get it perfectly clean. I'm not even gonna try, but I do like to get it a little spiffed up, especially that inside bore. All right, the inside of the crank pulley is all cleaned up here, looking pretty spiffy. That key channel is nice and clean as well. So now we're gonna go ahead and reinstall it. Well, now that we've got the crank pulley reinstalled and bolted in hand tight, we now have to torque it to spec. Now this thing is rated at 185 foot-pounds, and we can't just bump the starter to pull this to spec. We actually have to get back under there with a big old torque wrench and kunk it. just so we know that this is safe. Then we have to let the RTV cure for a couple of hours, ideally up to 24 hours, but unfortunately this truck has to be out of my garage within the next little bit. So I'm just going to hopefully back it out into the street and let it cure there a little bit more so it fully bakes in. But for now, let's get that crank pulley torqued to spec. It's just turning the engine over. Damn it. Whew. Well, after fighting with this thing for quite a while, we managed to wedge a pry bar up underneath part of the crankshaft pulley. On the inside, there's like little hard steel parts that I was able to wedge it under and then crank against that, and it locked it in. We're now up to torque spec. That's probably the hardest part of this whole thing. Honestly, getting that thing torqued back on there is almost impossible. Now, they do make a tool that allows you to do that probably way easier, but I don't want to go and buy yet another tool just for this one job, so you do what you can with what you got. Now it's time to run the serpentine belt back through everything, get that reattached, and then our oil leak is fixed.
Now, putting on a serpentine belt doesn't really sound like it would be that difficult of a thing, but I promise you, if you haven't done one of these before, they can actually be quite complicated. You're working around a lot of parts of the engine that are connected front to back, so you're weaving this thing through while also trying to keep tension on it. It can be a very difficult job if you don't know what you're doing. I haven't done one of these in quite a while, and this is sped up 20 times and still took me this long to get done. This one was particularly complicated because of the clutch fan that this car has, but man, I am glad I replaced this while I was in there because I do not want to do this again down the line.
Whew. Belt's on.
Also, always remember to put your fuses back after you're done with the job. That could have been a big issue. So now with the oil leak fixed and the RTV curing, it's time to move to the things that require this truck to be up in the air. So we're going to jack it up, get some jack stands under it, pull all of the tires off, and then it's time for us to do the brake bleed, get the new tires put on, and then do an alignment. But also, I found something else when I was laying under the truck that absolutely needs to be fixed. And that would be this torn steering rack boot. You can see that this thing has definitely seen better days. It is absolutely destroyed, so we're going to have to pull that sucker off and replace it with a brand new one, and we're also going to replace the grease that's gross and dirty in there with brand new fresh stuff. So let's waste no time, we got to take the tires off anyway, so we're starting with that to give ourselves a little bit more room as we get in there. Next, we're going to snip those wire ties off. Those are those metal ones. They're a little bit better for things that have really high heat going on, so I like using them, but they are a little bit of a pain to get off. Then we also remove the old boot, and we start unscrewing the tie rod from the ball joint here to separate them so we can actually get the new boot on. But before the new boot goes on, we got to clean up these surfaces, get all that dirty old grease out of there, and then repack those joints with fresh stuff. Then the new boot can go on, the lock nut goes back on, and then everything goes back together with the joint on the steering knuckle.
So with the boot reinstalled, all we have left to do now is the brake bleed, the new tires, and the alignment, but not necessarily in that order. See, what we're gonna do is take all of the tires off of the truck, take them over to the tire shop before they close tonight, because I can work as late as I want, but tire shops may not. So we're gonna take the tires out, get those replaced, bring them back. Before we put them on, we're gonna bleed all of the brakes, then we'll do the alignment once the tires are back on. Then this thing can go out the door overnight, let the RTV cure, and then by the morning tomorrow, we should be all good to go and send this back to its rightful owners. Now that we've got our tires mounted and balanced, it's time to bleed the brakes. And all I'm gonna need to do this is a bottle with some clear tube and some brake fluid. Now, as mentioned, this truck has spongy brakes. You can go about halfway down before it actually really engages anything. And since this is going to a relatively new driver, I wanna make sure that the brakes are nice and solid, so if any emergencies happen, they can hit those brakes and the car is gonna stop on a dime.
Honestly, I think doing brakes is a whole lot scarier for most people than it should be. Brakes are obviously a very crucial safety system, so handle things with care, but overall this process is actually fairly straightforward and simple. I start by removing any of the old gross brake fluid from the brake fluid reservoir under the hood here. I just use a liquid extractor to do this, and then I pump it into a cup that I had lying around just to take a look at it. It's really gross. Then I refill that tank with some fresh brake fluid and put fresh brake fluid in the bottom of our water bottle, and then hook that all together with a 1/4 inch clear hose. Then I put that 1/4-inch hose on the brake bleeder nipple of the respective brake. We go to all 4 corners of the truck, pumping the brakes on and off and on and off and on and off until all of the air is bled out.
Ooh, there we go. That was a lot of air and a lot of gross. All right, last one. Pump it. All right, I think we are good. And with our brakes bled, we can now finally put our new tires and rims back on the truck. Now, there was a ton of air and gross brake fluid that came out of this front left caliper, so hopefully that clears up our problem completely, and we can now get this thing back on the road safely. But before we do that, we're gonna clean all this rust and gunk off of the wheel mating surface. I don't like leaving the rims like this, so a little brass wire wheel will clean them right up.
Next, it was time to do the alignment, and if you haven't seen this method before, I definitely recommend checking it out. It's very cool. You basically wrap a string from tire to tire all the way around the car, and what you're aiming to do is effectively adjust the front tires so they are perfectly straight in line with that string, which means that both the front and the rear edge of the tire are just barely touching the string. And you can see it a little bit better here, where the back end of this tire is pushing way out on that string, and we have to pull that in to make sure that it's straight. And this goes to show how far off this alignment was before we got to the truck.
Well, roughly 24 hours later, the truck is ready for its first run and test drive out on the road. We got the alignment done, everything is locked up, the brakes are bled, and it's time to take this back on the road and see if all of our problems are fixed. But before we do that, I'm just gonna let it run and idle, get up to temp in the garage here, make sure that that oil leak is not leaking anymore, and that our RTV has properly set up. It is about 24 hours since I first put it on, so we should be more than okay, but I always like to be safe rather than take this out on the road and have oil start pouring out of the engine. Oh, I guess we're also taking a look and seeing if the serpentine belt is properly on there as well. We should be fine. Everything should be a-okay. All right, first start of the Taco after all the repairs. Let's see if she works. Well, it runs. Let's take a look under the hood, make sure everything is running as expected. Everything looks good under here. The real test is from up underneath. Let's take a look at that. All right, no immediate signs of oil, which is a great sign that nothing has gone catastrophically wrong. Now we gotta take her out, drive her around a little bit, and see how everything works. Oh, the brakes feel so much better. Oh my gosh. Getting the air out of the lines was definitely needed. Let's check our alignment. We are dead straight. Let's go. All right, we're gonna take her up on the road a little bit, maybe go grab some lunch, and check back when we get to the garage. Well, the truck is finished, Everything works exactly as intended. We have no more codes, no more leaks. The steering is phenomenal. The braking is phenomenal. This truck is officially ready to go back on the road as somebody's awesome first car. Now, this whole story started with Mike and his love of cars and his love of restoring and maintaining them and making them beautiful. Keeping something from 2007 on the road as long as it was is something that a lot of people aren't doing anymore today. You buy a new car, you trade it in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but a lot of people these days can't afford to do that anymore. And so learning the skills to maintain and work on your own vehicles is so imperative to being able to afford to live today. And I hope that everybody takes an opportunity to at least learn a little bit about their vehicles so you also can have awesome, cool cars like this your whole lives. Now, I'm no expert. Heck, I'm not even certified to work on cars, nor have I ever had any sort of formal training. Everything I know about working on cars has either been taught to me by the internet or by working with other people around me who know a ton about cars. But back in the day, people didn't have the internet to teach them about this stuff. People like Mike learned this stuff firsthand just by tinkering around and figuring out how to work on cars. And that's how Mike should be remembered, as somebody who was super passionate about cars and passionate about building them, and will let his legacy live on through the cars that he has built that other people have bought and sold over the years. But this one is going to his grandkids as their first car.